Having covered verbal communication, now want to move on to nonverbal communication. For today, we are going to look at a few different things. We want to talk about the principles of nonverbal communication, also looking at the channels of communication and the way that nonverbal works with verbal communication to enhance communication messages and to increase our communication competence. So before we get into the specifics of nonverbal, it's important to understand what nonverbal communication is. There are a few different definitions out there. Some people believe that nonverbal communication is communicating without speaking. They also say it's body language. If you looked at the PowerPoint slide, you know that this is not the case. Those are not two correct definitions for what we need to understand verbal communication. For the purpose of our class, nonverbal communication is a message expressed by non-linguistic means. So that means it's more than communicating without speaking, and it's more than body language. So you have to think about what makes something nonverbal communication. So when we talk about nonverbal communication, we need to look at the characteristics. So we know that it may be unintentional. So thinking about the things that you do with your body and your voice and how that might send a particular message, even though you're not intentionally trying to do that. So if you're nervous and you're twirling your hair, what is that message communicating, even though that's an unintentional behavior? It also consists of multiple codes, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the way that verbal and nonverbal communication work together. But think about the idea of when you're sad and you use a sad face, and then you also use a sad tone. So how those two different codes or channels are working together to send and enhance the message. It's also continuous and natural, and it's both universal and cultural, meaning that some nonverbal symbols and messages are universally decoded, while others are culture specific. So think about the sign thumbs up, okay. Those all mean something different in different cultures and different languages. So I'm not going to go into depth with all of the principles because your book explains it and you've already looked through the PowerPoint slides, hopefully. So I just want to touch on a few key ideas. I think one of the important things I want to reiterate is the idea of how verbal and nonverbal messages work together. So your book talked about a few different things, beginning with repeating and ending with controlling. So thinking about how when you say yes and you nod your head yes, that would be an example of repeating. That's a way of making sure that your message is received in the way that it was intended, which is actually the definition of communication competence. They can also work to contradict each other. So maybe you're telling someone that you're really okay with something, but you have a really sad face on. It can stand in the place of, so instead of saying yes, I can simply nod my head. It can it can complement. So it can help to strengthen the message. So I'm sorry with your sad face as opposed to I'm sorry and you look really happy and not sorry, and people will interpret that as being disingenuous or sarcastic. It can accent as well. So let's say you don't want a little kid to touch the stove, so you yell no. That's a way of accenting. You're sending a verbal message with the word, but you're also increasing the importance of it by the tone you're using. And you can also control conversations with nonverbal. So let's say I decide not to say anything at all. Just like that. What does that do? It's going to invite potentially someone into a conversation. It's going to tell them it's their turn. So those are just some of the ways that verbal and nonverbal communication interact. It's also important to look at the way that nonverbal communication can help to communicate and manage who you are. Hopefully you watched the clip from Hitch and you saw a little bit about the idea of dancing and how dancing can put forth a particular image about who you are or how others might perceive you. And then I'm going to jump to the idea of nonverbal messages, because this is interpersonal communication, can help to create and maintain relationships. So it serves a social function, we know. It can send a message about the relationship, where you are in the relationship, where you would like the relationship to go. So for example, let's say you're out on a first date and you're really interested in the person. What can you do with your body? What can you do to show the other person without saying anything that you're interested in them? Well, research shows that if you are really interested in someone, you can actually turn your body towards them, and this is often unintentional, one of the things we talked about, the characteristics, and your body then aligns itself towards the other person, and this communicates to them, sends the message that you are interested. Also, increasing your eye contact with that person, potentially, giving them a pat on the back or, a gentle shoulder rub, that lets them know that they're potentially something more than just a friendship. It also communicates the nature of the relationship. So again, think about that pat, that sort of back rub. When is that appropriate and when isn't it appropriate? If it occurs in a workplace, we know that potentially that relationship has crossed a line, if it's with a superior. If it's in a bar with an equal, a peer, then potentially that means that it's more of a romantic relationship. Also important to think about is the idea of nonverbal communication as a tool to deceive people. There are lots of people who believe that there are tells. There are ways to uncover when people are deceiving, things that you can watch with people's bodies. People think that some people look a certain way, like up to the left or down to the right, but research has actually showed that that is not necessarily accurate, that it actually varies too much from person to person to make sure that that's a true statement. So no surefire way to tell that someone is lying or deceiving you. So you really want to rely on the past relationship you have with that person. And so you might know what they do when they lie. So maybe they won't look you in the eye. Maybe they look you in the eye too much. So you want to pay attention to some of those different cues and messages. The other important piece to understand about nonverbal communication are what are called nonverbal messages. You might have seen in my PowerPoint, or I might have already mentioned it through this video, I also use the term code synonymously with a message. So think about these as a code or a message is really a particular package, a characteristic of nonverbal communication that has with it certain rules and norms. So your book talked about body gestures, appearance, facial messages, eye messages, also known as oculesics, spatial messages, artifactual messages, touch, silence, and time. So all of those different channels, those different codes, those different messages, again, all synonymous, all meaning the same thing, help us to understand what is going on. And we use them in a strategic way, hopefully, to get our message across clearly. So I don't want to go too much into detail about those different types of messages because you've read about them, but do know that they work, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the characteristics, that these messages or codes or channels work together. So if you're thinking about the paralinguistic message, that could potentially work together with the verbal message. The touch can also work together with the idea of space or proxemics. And all of those are going to help the receiver hopefully understand what's going on. And so I just want to end with thinking about competence. So what can you do to be a more competent communicator with nonverbal communication? Be mindful, extremely important. Because a lot of the messages we send are unintentional, you want to start to be a little bit more mindful or hyper aware of how others might perceive you and what you're doing. Also, just be aware that there are different ways to be effective and ineffective in the way that you send messages, and that you really want to, as your book suggests, encode and decode with care.